Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a foggy Dutch morning in the 1700s. You're walking along the damp cobbled streets of Delft, boots slightly slipping on algae-slicked stones. The canals reflect the overcast sky like dull pewter mirrors. A cart creaks by, loaded with crates labeled fragile, each one packed with delicate tableware painted with dainty, swooping tulips in navy blue glaze. Someone sneezes behind you. It's probably the cold. You pull your cloak tighter. Now, I'll warn you, you probably won't survive this era's dinner etiquette. If you so much as butter your bread with the wrong knife, a merchant's wife might eye you like you've proposed marriage mid-soup course. But that's half the fun, isn't it? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You turn the corner and arrive at a window display. It's not jewelry, not fresh produce, just row upon row of tulip-covered plates, bowls, and teacups, a full-service setting of floral frenzy. Inside, the shop smells like wet clay and wood smoke. There's a kiln in the back that radiates the kind of dry heat your fingers ache for. The tableware here isn't just decoration. In 18th century Delft, it's cultural currency. You pick up a small dessert plate. Painted across its center is a single swooping tulip, mid-bloom, flanked by delicate leafy scrolls. It's smooth, cool, surprisingly heavy. The design looks hand-done, imperfect in a charming way, like someone stayed up late, candle flickering, just to finish this. You're not wrong. That's probably exactly what happened. It's hard to overstate just how much the Dutch loved tulips in this era. You've heard of tulip mania, those wild, speculative flower auctions in the 1630s where people sold entire estates for a single bulb, but that was just the spark. The fire burned for generations. Tulips were more than flowers. They were a symbol, a social statement, and perhaps most curiously, a design trend that just would not die. This shop? It's one of many. Delft, a mid-sized town famous for its water engineers and melancholic skies, suddenly found itself the epicenter of Europe's ceramic scene. Why? Because the Dutch East India Company, yes, those guys, had been importing Chinese porcelain since the 1600s, and Dutch consumers loved it. But when China's Ming dynasty collapsed and trade slowed to a trickle, local artisans saw a gap and leapt into it. They couldn't make true porcelain. They didn't have the right kaolin clay, so they got clever. They developed a kind of earthenware with a tin glaze finish that looked like porcelain from a distance, very on brand for a country of clever traders and polite tricksters. Now imagine you're a middle-class burgher in 1702. You don't own a manor, you certainly don't have land, but you do have a good eye, a steady income, and a dining room where the neighbors occasionally dine. You need a set of tulip-patterned plates. Not want, need, because without them, your table looks naked, provincial, dangerously unmodern, and heaven forbid anyone think you're stuck in 1685. Historians still argue whether this obsession with tulip designs was about national pride, aesthetic preference, or just a domino effect of keeping up with the floral-patterned Joneses. But you see it everywhere. On vases, tiles, sugar pots, even chamber pots. Yes, nothing says refined like doing your business into a ceramic garden. The tulip pattern isn't just visual either, it's encoded. Some arrangements show single tulips in profile, the modest bloom. Others burst with ornate scrolls and vining flowers, signaling exuberance or just wealth. Like how modern people flex with latte art or minimalist iPhone setups. As you step back outside into the fog, you pass a tea house. Inside, a table is set. Every cup and saucer features variations of the same hand-painted tulip, none of them quite identical. The whole scene glows from the firelight. A group of well-dressed women sip politely, each one tilting her cup just so, revealing the underside stamp, a small curly mark that says, "Yes, this is real Delftware." You imagine them gently judging each other's sets. Who has the newest glaze? Whose painter uses the prettiest stems? Who has, gasp, a chip? The streets hum with quiet clinking from behind shutters, a subtle symphony of porcelain pride. You feel a bit out of place in your woolen coat, your boots muddy, no tulip plate to call your own. But don't worry, you'll fit in soon enough. There's a kiln to visit, a dinner party to crash, and at least one scandalous teacup coming your way. But first, let the patterns swirl a little longer in your mind. Let your feet rest in the imaginary warmth of that shop's hearth. And maybe, just maybe, imagine holding your own tulip bowl, soup steaming gently, history clinging to every glazed petal. You shuffle farther along Delft's narrow canal, your breath fogging in the brisk morning air, and you can't stop noticing tulips. Not the real kind, they're out of season, but everywhere else. Tulips painted on shutters, tulips embroidered into handkerchiefs, tulips carved into the wooden trim of doors. If you squint, you swear you even see a tulip-shaped bread loaf in a baker's window. And here's the funny part. Nobody's even talking about tulips anymore. They're just there, part of the background noise of everyday life, like Wi-Fi routers or IKEA end tables in our world. But the roots of this quiet obsession? Oh, they're tangled deep in Dutch history. You settle down on a wooden bench beside a canal, watching a barge drift by, loaded with crates of, you guessed it, ceramic wares. The cargo might be headed to Amsterdam, or maybe as far as London or Lisbon. These tulip-themed plates and cups are in demand all over Europe. But why? Why did a single flower, foreign, fragile, and frankly kind of awkward-looking, become the ultimate symbol of status? Let's rewind a bit. In the late 1500s, tulip bulbs arrived in the Netherlands from the Ottoman Empire, probably through the hands of European diplomats and botanists. They were immediately exotic, mysterious, difficult to grow, especially the broken varieties, with flamed or striped petals caused by a virus. Naturally, those became the most valuable. Nothing says I have too much disposable income like a flower that might die before blooming. By the 1630s, tulip mania was in full swing. Speculators traded bulbs like stock options. There are stories, some exaggerated, some chillingly real, of people mortgaging their homes for a single Semper Augustus bulb. When the market crashed, well, so did a few egos and bank accounts. But here's the twist. While the market collapsed, the meaning of tulips stuck around. You see, tulips never really stopped being cool in the Dutch imagination. They were simply absorbed, softened. Instead of being auctioned off in pubs, they started blooming forever on tea sets, a kind of aesthetic redemption arc. By the 1700s, if you couldn't afford a garden, you could at least afford a tulip-adorned plate. It became a social shortcut. I appreciate beauty, I have taste, and I'm probably not poor. Even better, you didn't have to risk frost or fungus, or the heartbreak of a wilted petal. A tulip couldn't die. It could chip, sure, but even that became oddly charming. Historians still argue whether this lingering obsession with tulips came from lingering nostalgia for the mania itself, or whether it was something more subconscious. A nation reclaiming a floral folly and turning it into art. What's clear is that by the early 1700s, the tulip wasn't just a flower. It was an entire visual language, a symbol that said, "Look at me, I'm civilized." You get up from your bench and walk along a quieter street now, flanked by tidy brick homes with gabled roofs and wrought iron boot scrapers by the door. At one window, you spot a family setting the table for dinner. A boy, maybe 10, is carefully placing plates from a wooden tray. The dishes are cream-colored, rimmed with blue scrolls, and in the center of each, a tulip, mid-bloom. You watch the father nod approvingly. This isn't just dinner, it's performance. And let's not forget the practical psychology of it. Food in this era wasn't exactly bright. You're talking browns, tans, maybe a turnip yellow if you're lucky. A bit of roasted eel or boiled cabbage doesn't exactly pop off a plain wooden platter, but put it on a gleaming white surface with graceful blue tulips dancing around the edge, suddenly the humble stew looks almost refined. That contrast, the muted food against the blooming ceramic, was no accident. Dutch society in the 18th century prized restraint and order, but with just a hint of flair, like wearing a perfectly tailored black coat with a slightly outrageous hat. So yes, the tulip pattern had staying power. It worked on so many levels: practical, decorative, symbolic. It was one of the few trends that didn't need to shout to be heard. And over time, it became such a quiet fixture that people stopped noticing it altogether, even as it sat under every spoon and beside every crust of rye bread. You round another corner and spot a curious little scene: a woman selling used Delftware from a cart. Some pieces are chipped, some faded, a few stacked together like ceramic pancakes. Each one still carries its tulip, though, some bold and blobby, others fine and fussy like a wedding invitation. You pick up a bowl. The glaze has cracked into a spider web of fine lines, but the flower in the center still reaches upward, defiant. You wonder, how many hands has this bowl passed through? How many mouths slurped pea soup from it? How many dinner table arguments, flirty glances, or quiet prayers has it overheard? The woman smiles. She says something in thick Dutch, gestures at the bowl, and taps her chest. You don't need a translator. It was her grandmother's. And just like that, you understand. These dishes weren't just for show. They were memory keepers, identity holders. And at the center of it all, a bloom, frozen in glaze, refusing to wilt. You walk away slowly, bowl still in hand, the glaze warm from the sun now peeking through the clouds. Somewhere in your mind, you start wondering what your own dishes at home say about you. Probably not much, but here in 1700s Delft, they speak volumes. You're following the scent of clay and wood smoke now. Your footsteps echo through a maze of alleys that all smell vaguely like damp laundry and hot bread, until you reach a squat, soot-stained building near the edge of town. A kiln. Not the sort of thing that makes your heart race, maybe, but then again, you've never watched fake porcelain change the trajectory of Western aesthetics in a single firing, have you? The doors creak open, and the heat rushes out to meet you like a panting dog. You step into a space that hums, not with noise exactly, but with motion. Artisans lean over workbenches. Stacks of unfinished plates teeter like toppling books. There's chalk dust on every surface, and a boy no older than 12 is stirring a vat of white glaze with the seriousness of a priest mixing communion wine. Welcome to the fantasy of porcelain, made in Europe by people who had never seen a Chinese kiln up close in their lives. So here's the scoop. In the 1600s, Chinese porcelain was the peak of sophistication. Europeans were obsessed. It was translucent, delicate, somehow light and strong all at once. Naturally, Dutch traders brought it back by the shipload. But once the Ming dynasty collapsed, porcelain shipments slowed to a trickle. That left a gap, a ceramic power vacuum. And Dutch artisans in Delft, ever practical, decided, why not fake it? Their version? Tin-glazed earthenware. They'd take basic clay, cover it with a white opaque glaze, and fire it until it hardened into something that looked porcelain adjacent. It didn't have the translucency or the ethereal ping of true porcelain, but it looked fancy. From a distance, in candlelight, after a few drinks. The best part, you could customize it. Chinese imports were gorgeous, yes, but standardized. Delftware could be local, personal, and nothing felt more personal in the Netherlands than a nice, fat tulip. One painter gestures for you to come closer. He's hunched over a plate, brush poised, adding curling leaves to the tulip stem. The blue pigment, cobalt oxide, is more grayish now, but it'll bloom into deep indigo once fired. Every line must be painted in reverse. Once it hits the glaze and the kiln, there's no correcting mistakes. So the artist developed an almost musical rhythm. Long stroke, pause, flick, breathe, repeat. You watch his hands move, trembling slightly from fatigue or too much coffee. He's painted the same flower 100 times this week, and yet each one is just a little different. A petal wider here, a swirl a bit off-center there. These tiny variations became the signature of Delftware, mass-produced, but still somehow personal. Historians still debate whether this ceramic movement was born of necessity or national pride. Were the Dutch simply filling a market gap left by China's export drop? Or were they asserting a new European aesthetic identity? Either way, the result was a cottage industry turned economic phenomenon. By 1700, there were over 30 pottery workshops in Delft alone. That's a lot of plates. You pass a shelf stacked with unfinished pieces, waiting for their turn in the kiln. Some have geometric designs. Others feature pastoral scenes, windmills, cows, a man fishing with a comically large hat. But most have tulips. Big ones, small ones, single blooms, bouquets. Sometimes the tulip shares space with birds or vines or those surreal little cherubs that appear uninvited in most 18th century art. A kiln master nods at you. He's checking the temperature with a practiced squint. These aren't digital ovens. There's no thermostat. Just wood, flame, and experience. You realize how much risk is involved. A kiln too hot? Cracked glaze. Too cool? Dull colors. Either way, money down the drain. The economics of it were surprisingly delicate. Making Delftware wasn't cheap, and the workers weren't exactly rolling in guild bonuses. Many toiled long hours for little pay, all in service of a product they'd likely never own themselves. It's like crafting diamonds and living on rice porridge. You spot a jug cooling on a side table, still warm from firing. The tulip painted on its side is almost abstract now, just broad swooping lines, like someone dreaming of a flower rather than painting one. And still, it holds that unmistakable shape. You realize how powerful the tulip silhouette has become. Simplified to its essence, it's both instantly recognizable and vaguely unreal, like the Nike swoosh, but botanical. A boy drops a cup. It shatters. No one yells. A few people glance, wince, then move on. Breakage is just part of the process. You wonder how many would-be masterpieces ended in ruin on these floors. How many half-finished designs will never be seen because someone sneezed at the wrong moment. You follow a narrow hallway to a side room where rejected pieces are stacked like forgotten soldiers. Some are beautiful. Others are, let's say, experimental. One plate features a tulip with eyes. Another has what looks like a goat wearing a bonnet. Even in failure, the artistry is clear and slightly hilarious. One shelf has practice tiles, test strokes of cobalt, quick sketches of stems and petals. You run your fingers over a tile with nothing but a single tulip, perfectly painted. That flower has no context, no dish, no function. It exists purely for itself. It's kind of poetic. You glance back into the main room. The painters are still working. The kiln still glows. Somewhere, more plates are cooling. And now you understand the magic trick of 1700s Delft. They weren't just making tableware. They were making a statement. We don't need Chinese imports. We have our own beauty, our own patterns, our own petals. And they weren't wrong. You step back into the street, carrying the scent of glaze and fire with you. The world outside looks a little grayer now, a little duller, until you spot a woman hanging her laundry, and behind her, a row of tulip-painted tiles gleaming on the wall. The kiln's work never really ends. You're invited to dinner. Not just any dinner, mind you. Tonight you're the guest of honor at the home of a prosperous Dutch merchant family. They import spices from the Indies and own 2 warehouses, a canal-facing townhouse, and, more importantly, a complete set of tulip-themed tableware. That last bit is what really seals their status. You stand nervously in the tiled vestibule, your coat taken by a silent servant, and you're ushered into a warm, candlelit dining room. The walls are hung with moody landscapes and sea battle prints, but it's the table that pulls your eye. Laid out before you is a symphony of symmetry, a linen tablecloth so crisp it probably crackles, silver cutlery polished within an inch of its life, and at every place setting, plates rimmed with deep blue tulips, each one seemingly turned just so to face its owner. It's not a meal, it's a stage. You take your seat gingerly, already aware of how stiff your posture has become. The chairs are stiff too, clearly not built for slouching. Across the table, a young woman adjusts her napkin just enough to reveal the underside stamp on her bowl. Delft. Not a cheap knockoff from Rotterdam. The real deal. You get the feeling she's done this before. Back then, dining wasn't just about eating. It was a social display, a subtle war of glances, posture, and table placement. And your dishes, they weren't just holding food, they were holding reputation. The tulip-themed sets especially, those were what polite society expected. You couldn't exactly show up with an onion-patterned soup plate and expect to be taken seriously. Your host, a well-fed man with a fine lace cravat and fingers that glint with gold rings, is clearly proud of his collection. He gestures toward the serving platter, an oval dish etched with 4 blooming tulips and a windmill dead center, as if to say, "Look at this, we have arrived." And everyone does. Even the soup seems to taste fancier coming from a tulip bowl. Thick, creamy, lightly spiced, a cardamom tang at the back of your throat. As you lift your spoon, you notice the pattern beneath the surface. Just faintly, the tulip peeks through the broth. Is it watching you eat? Possibly. In the early 1700s, upper-middle-class Dutch families like this one took enormous pride in hosting meals. Tableware wasn't just functional, it was narrative, a story told with plates. One set might feature tulips and birds, another mythological scenes. But tulips were evergreen, safe, elegant, and quietly patriotic. Historians still argue whether these tableware choices were rooted in aesthetic taste or social signaling. Did people genuinely like the patterns, or were they just performing good taste? Hard to say, but the number of times your host nods toward the soup tureen says something. That tureen, by the way, is absurd. It's the size of a small dog, with 2 curved handles shaped like vines and a fat tulip in relief on each side. The lid is topped with what might be a parrot, though at this point you're not entirely sure. Decorative restraint was not always a priority. As you move through the courses, salted fish, roasted root vegetables, something gelatinous you choose not to identify, the tulips reappear over and over. A small petal here on a plate's edge, a fully bloomed flower in the center of a dish that once held eel. The tulips become a kind of rhythm, comforting and predictable, like background music you stop noticing until it stops. You begin to appreciate how much planning goes into a dinner like this. The host's wife likely coordinated the entire table to match, down to the blue-ribboned napkins. The servants know the plate rotation by heart. There are rules. Oh, so many rules. For instance, you're not supposed to cut your bread with your dinner knife. That's what the side knife is for. You must compliment the glaze, even if you hate it. And if someone refers to their new spring pattern, you'd better nod as if it matters more than the trade deficit with Spain. Across the table, one guest leans in and says, "This glaze? It's from the Clace factory. Fired twice, you can tell by the shine." You nod as if you absolutely can tell by the shine. In truth, it all glints alike in candlelight, but that's not the point. The performance is. And here's the kicker. The tulip theme isn't just aesthetic, it's aspirational. These dishes reflect a connection to nature, exotic trade, national pride, and aesthetic refinement all in one. The Dutch Republic was one of the wealthiest, most connected places on earth at this time. The dishes said, "We're worldly, but also grounded. We're rich, but not garish. We eat boiled turnips, but we do it beautifully." As dessert arrives, a tart glazed with syrup and a suspiciously shiny apple slice, you realize your plate has no tulip. Just scrolling vines and a tiny blue rabbit. A serving error? A subtle message? You look around. Everyone else has tulips. You've been demoted. But don't worry, it's probably not personal. Maybe. After dinner, the host invites everyone into the salon for brandy. You walk slowly, trying to recall which fork you used incorrectly. The brandy is warm, the room cozy, and a servant carries in a ceramic dish of dried fruit, again tulip-themed. You find yourself comforted by the pattern now. It's familiar. It means something. You realize you've been gently indoctrinated. The tulips have done their job. By the time you step back out into the cool night, you don't see Delft's streets anymore. You see 1,000 tiny blue petals, looping and curling in your memory like smoke. The dinner party is over, but the plates remain like silent witnesses to the soft theater of social climbing. And if you're being honest, you kind of want a set for yourself now. The morning after the dinner party, you shuffle through Delft in a soft food fog, your mind still replaying the choreography of tulip-patterned tableware and perfectly timed small talk. You pass another shop window, more ceramics. But this time something catches your eye. 2 neighboring dishes, both nearly identical, except one has a small gilded rim and the other a subtle chip. You squint. Could this be competitive tableware? Oh yes, welcome to the dinner party arms race. You see, in the polite society of 1700s Dutch towns, everyone hosted and everyone judged. Silently, of course, but with almost military precision. One week your neighbors displayed a new tulip-glazed butter dish. The next week you had to debut something even more refined. A lidded sauce boat, maybe, or a tulip motif gravy boat shaped like a swan. Not because you needed one, but because they didn't have one yet. It was like a genteel ceramic Cold War. The arms race played out in little ways. The sheer number of matching pieces you owned said everything. A full set might include not just dinner and dessert plates, but teacups, coffee cups, bread plates, fish platters, condiment pots, cheese domes, ladles, and something called a posset pot, used for serving hot spiced milk and ale. Yes, people really drank that. All of them naturally rimmed with tiny tulips and fussy scrollwork. And it didn't stop with matching. It had to be current. Ceramic fashion shifted in slow but deliberate waves. Maybe tulips one year had tighter buds, the next more open blooms. Owning last season's pattern? Embarrassing, like showing up to a masquerade ball in last year's feathers. You make your way into a public market square where stalls are just beginning to open. There's a potter's table here, more rustic than the workshops you saw before. But the same ward is underway, just in miniature. 2 women lean over a stack of newly glazed teacups, comparing the detail on the leaves. One murmurs, "The shading's better on mine." The other lifts her chin and says, "But mine's from the John Zone kiln." Historians still argue whether Delftware artisans were catering to this growing demand for status symbol ceramics, or whether their artistic ambitions were simply hijacked by consumer culture. Either way, demand meant innovation. Workshops experimented with new shapes, handles, lids, and glazes just to stay ahead. Some even dabbled in 3-dimensional tulips, little sculpted blooms perched like knobs atop lids or nestled into the handles of sugar pots. It got extra. You duck into a cafe to warm your hands and are served coffee in a cup so fine you hesitate to hold it. There's a tulip climbing one side of the saucer and curling onto the cup itself, and when you tilt it, a tiny ship appears hidden inside the bloom. It's adorable. Also, probably a flex. The waiter refills your drink with a practiced flourish, careful not to splash the glaze. He nods at your admiration of the cup and says, "Limited batch, only for the shop's regulars." And just like that, the arms race reaches you too. In homes across the Netherlands, this quiet competition was relentless. One woman added gold edging to her platters. Another painted initials into the tulip petals. A particularly bold family once commissioned a punch bowl featuring tulips and windmills. Some whispered it was gauche, but everyone peeked at it anyway. You see, the competition wasn't just about plates, it was about presence, style, the ability to host a meal where the food didn't have to dazzle because the dishes already did. Your soup could be thin, your meat a little chewy, but if your guests had tulip-patterned side plates and matching teacups for after, they'd forgive anything. Well, almost anything. A crack, a visibly repaired handle, that was a gamble. And here's where it gets oddly sweet. Many families began developing a sort of personal relationship with their ceramics. Children had their favorite bowl. Grandmothers passed down their tulip plates with whispered warnings. "Don't use this one for guests. They'll never give it back." You pass another home, windows open to the street. Inside, someone's hosting brunch. You spot a jug with a particularly dramatic tulip spray. It's being used to hold hot milk, but the way it's presented, it might as well be the crown jewels. The guests admire it politely. Someone feigns disinterest, but you know they're noting every detail. You begin to realize tulip-themed tableware was never just decor. It was subtle, beautiful leverage, a way to navigate social hierarchy without speaking word. Say nothing, smile gently, and pour your tea from a tulip teapot shaped like a blooming gourd. Message received. Of course, some went overboard. You hear stories, some true, some gloriously exaggerated, of families going into debt for just one more matching platter, of marriages strained over chipped sugar bowls, of rival hostesses seating enemies next to the most flawed pieces just to provoke quiet horror. One woman, legend says, had her tulip collection catalogued and numbered. Guests would receive invitations reading, "You are cordially invited to dine beside pattern number 14B, late bloom with gold stem." You want to laugh, but part of you admires the sheer dedication. By the time you walk back out of the cafe, the street feels different. Each window you pass, each table you glimpse, becomes part of the silent contest. And yet there's comfort in it. These weren't cruel competitions. They were expressions of care, artistry, pride. You think back to the host from last night beaming over his soup tureen. Was he showing off? Sure. But he also just loved that thing. Maybe it reminded him of a trip to Amsterdam, or the time he finally made his father proud. Maybe the tulip on the lid wasn't just a flower, but a memory glazed into permanence. And you? You're starting to feel like you'd do the same. You're walking now through Delft's quieter neighborhoods, where the canal-side homes aren't grand, but still carry the quiet pride of generations. Laundry flaps in the wind like makeshift flags. Cats prowl windowsills. And just when you think you've had your fill of ceramics for the day, you overhear a curious phrase drifting from an open window. "Did you see the way she served the tea with the peacock handle?" You pause. Yes, It turns out, tableware in 1700s Holland could talk. Not literally, of course, but the choices, the patterns, even the handles whispered all kinds of things across the dinner table. The language of tulip-themed ceramics was as real and complex as any handwritten note or fan flutter, especially when it came to tea sets. Tea was still a bit of a novelty at this time, expensive, exotic, and slightly scandalous. The act of drinking it, full of subtext. And the items that accompanied it, the tulip-rimmed cups, the sugar pots, the ceramic caddies shaped like blossoms or tiny shrines, were stage props in a very polite drama. You walk into a salon where a group of well-dressed women are gathered around a low table. A tea service is in progress. The host wears a smile like a mask, and her guests lean forward just slightly, their posture alert. Not from the caffeine, from the stakes. Each piece of the tea set is part of the message. The teapot is stout, with a tulip curling around the spout and a gold-trimmed lid. The sugar bowl is shaped like a tulip bulb, literal and symbolic. The tray is oval, hand-painted, each bloom pointing inward toward the pot, as if offering praise. And then there's the handle on the serving ladle, a peacock, proud, flashy, absolutely deliberate. You sit quietly and observe. The woman across from you gently turns her cup, revealing the tulip stem that spirals upward from base to lip. A smile plays at her mouth, and she glances, just briefly, at her neighbor's more modest design. Message delivered. This, dear listener, is the unspoken art of the table. You might think of modern fashion, or car brands, or Instagram posts carefully curated to say, "I'm relaxed, successful, and definitely not trying too hard." The tulip plates and tea sets were the same thing, a second language, and the people who spoke it fluently were fluent in power. Historians still debate how conscious this language was. Did people knowingly wield their tulip tableware as social tools, or had they absorbed the meaning so deeply they came out without thinking? Either way, the pattern mattered. A single tulip in full bloom suggested refinement and elegance. Multiple tulips could imply abundance, but too many and you'd stray into ostentation. Pale blue glaze? Classic. Deep cobalt with gold edging? Flashy. A handle shaped like a vine? Graceful. A dragon? A little much, unless you were signaling your connections to the East Indies trade. There were flirtation tactics, too. Yes, flirting with ceramics. Say you serve tea in a cup with a small tulip on the inside bottom. As your guest drinks, the flower is gradually revealed. It's a slow unveiling, like a wink in reverse. For a certain kind of guest, this might be interpreted as charming. For another, entirely improper. It's the 1700s equivalent of a text message with an ambiguous emoji. And if you think that's too subtle, consider the conversation plate. These were dishes decorated with scenes or symbols, birds perched on tulips, hearts woven into vines, initials worked into the stems. A well-placed plate could hint at affection, allegiance, or, in the case of one famously gossiped about widow, intent to remarry. You walk through Delft's central square now, and a traveling merchant calls out his wares. Among the goods, a stack of new plates with bolder patterns. These aren't your grandmother's tulips. The lines are thicker, the blooms exaggerated. You overhear a woman sniff, "So modern," not a compliment. Each design shift carried risk. Be too old-fashioned, and you were behind the times. Too avant-garde, risky. One particularly daring plate design replaced tulips with peonies, prompting weeks of hushed debate. Peonies in Delft? What next? Figs! There's also a darker side to the language of tableware. Settled digs. One family was known to serve difficult guests on slightly imperfect plates, slightly off-centered tulips, faded glaze, even a tiny unglazed spot at the base. It wasn't obvious enough to provoke, but it was enough to unsettle, like sitting someone on the least comfortable chair and pretending it's random. You pause at a shop window where a new collection is on display. The Spring Conversati set, the placard reads. A full 12-piece tea service featuring tulips in pairs, leaning toward each other across the cups. Some critics say the design is too intimate. Others say it's charmingly modern. You suspect it depends who's doing the sipping. By now you've started noticing everything. The way certain tulips have 5 petals and others 6. The way the stems curve, toward or away from the center. The thickness of the glaze. You're learning the dialect. And with that fluency comes power. A young man passes you, holding a small plate tucked under his arm, wrapped in cloth. You see just the edge, a swirling vine with 2 leaves and half a tulip. It could mean anything. A gift? A subtle threat? A romantic advance? You'll never know. What you do know is this. In 1700s Delft, a plate was never just a plate. It was a voice. And if you listened closely enough, it always had something to say. You find yourself in the back of a chapel now. Not a cathedral, nothing grand, but a quiet little Protestant church with plain benches and cool, unadorned stone. The sermon has just ended. People shuffle out politely, murmuring greetings, adjusting collars, giving nods that say more than words. And as you rise to follow them, something catches your eye near the vestry. A small tile plaque mounted on the wall, lined with, yes, tulips. Even here, you think, even in a house of worship. Welcome to the world of floral propaganda. It wasn't just about fashion or flirtation. Tulip-patterned ceramics had meaning, and it went deeper than tea and soup. These blue and white blooms wove themselves into the Dutch identity, not by accident, but very much on purpose. In the 1700s, those dainty little flowers carried a quiet political message, often delivered right alongside the mashed turnips. You step outside, and the sunlight slants across the cobblestones, catching in the sheen of a decorative plate displayed in a merchant's window. At first glance, it's the same story. Tulips, vines, a windmill maybe. But look closer and you spot something odd. Tiny ships tucked into the foliage, and behind the bloom, a faint outline of a lion. Ah, there it is. You see, the Dutch Republic in the 18th century was a proud, bustling empire, a global trading giant, one of the richest nations on earth, but it was also a small, vulnerable country, perpetually negotiating its position between bigger powers like France and Britain. National identity mattered, and the visual language of tulips helped sell that identity. The tulip, though imported originally from the Ottoman Empire, had by now become as Dutch as dikes and dairy. Featuring it on ceramics, especially Delftware, was a way to declare, "We are tasteful, prosperous, and uniquely Dutch." A quiet act of patriotism in blue glaze. Some of the more elaborate pieces, especially commemorative plates or wall tiles, added even more symbolism. A tulip might lean protectively over a Dutch ship. A field of flowers might bloom beneath a sturdy windmill. In some cases, the tulip stem twisted into the silhouette of a lion, the heraldic symbol of the Dutch Republic. Not obvious, but present. Historians still debate whether average consumers were aware of the nationalist messages woven into their tableware, or if it was more of an elite artist's trick, like political cartoons hidden in plain sight. But evidence suggests at least some buyers knew what they were doing, especially the wealthy ones. You duck into the workshop of a tile painter. He's old, maybe in his 60s, with a streak of cobalt blue paint on his cheek that he's clearly forgotten about. He shows you a panel, 6 tiles meant to be assembled into a long scene. It shows a canal-side village, flowers in bloom, a woman carrying a basket of tulips, and in the background, a Dutch warship anchored with its sails proudly furled. It's propaganda, but make it charming. The painter chuckles and says, "For the governor's house, he likes to remember we're still a mighty people." Then he leans in and whispers, "But the ship's too small. It'll look silly next to the tulips." And that's part of the genius. These visual stories could be interpreted differently depending on the viewer. A dinner guest might see a simple bouquet. A diplomat might see national pride. A foreign merchant might see wealth, order, and artistry. The same plate, different messages. One particularly famous piece, a large charger plate, now sitting in a museum somewhere, shows a single tulip rising from a field, larger than life, with small Dutch houses nestled beneath its leaves. Interpretations vary. Is it a symbol of national unity, prosperity, or a quiet warning that tulips, though beautiful, also cast shadows? Some historians point to another layer, the Protestant work ethic. Dutch Calvinism emphasized modesty, cleanliness, and discipline, values reflected in the simple lines and serene patterns of tulip ceramics. No garish reds or golds, just calm blues and whites, sometimes a bit of yellow. Floral patterns that said, "We don't need extravagance. We are strong in simplicity." And yet, the simplicity was calculated. Those quiet designs carried layers of intention. You wander into a public building, a sort of town hall, and see a wall tile map. Around the map, the border is made entirely of tulips, curling around compass points. And at the top, a coat of arms, flanked by 2 floral sprays. The Netherlands wasn't hiding its pride, it was glazing it. There's even evidence that Delftware with tulip motifs was offered as diplomatic gifts. When ambassadors visited, they were sometimes presented with commemorative plates or vases bearing both the flower and some other national emblem. A subtle way to say, "Welcome to our table. We are refined, organized, and impossible to ignore." Not every plate made these statements, of course. Most were just nice dishes. But when enough of them appear with recurring symbols, clustered in official homes, passed through merchants' hands and politicians' tables, you start to see the bigger pattern, literally. You stop at another market stall and overhear a merchant brag about a new set of dinner plates with updated tulips, longer stems, bolder leaves, just like the ones in The Hague. That tells you everything. Even something as quiet as a dinner plate could carry political fashion. Even now, centuries later, museums struggle to classify many of these pieces. Are they art? Propaganda? Mere dishes? A few experts even argue that Delftware tulip designs represent one of the earliest forms of soft power branding, a way to signal economic stability and national confidence without firing a shot. You smile at that. The idea that a soup bowl could win hearts and influence trade agreements feels both absurd and perfectly plausible in this world of glazed double meanings. And as you walk back through Delft's orderly streets, where the canal water reflects tight brick facades and the occasional wayward duck, you understand. The tulip on your breakfast plate may not be shouting, but it is speaking. You just have to know how to listen. The sun's dipped lower in the sky now, casting long golden shadows across Delft's rooftops. You find yourself heading toward the edge of town, following the smell of smoke and a faint metallic tang that hangs in the air, almost like damp stone and dried ink. There's another workshop tucked between two houses here, almost hidden. The door is open. You step inside. And what greets you is the soft chaos of artistry. Brushes resting in cloudy pots, clay shards crunching underfoot, and shelves lined with half-finished bowls and plates, each one bearing the early outline of a tulip or vine. This isn't the polished front end of a ceramics factory. It's the backstage, the kiln door, quite literally. You're about to meet the people who brought the tulips to life. They're not aristocrats or merchants. They're artisans. Men, women, and occasionally children, hunched over spinning wheels and wooden benches, sleeves rolled, hands stained indigo and ochre. And unlike the parlor talkers who debate glaze tones with wine in hand, these folks live their work. Their world is fire, clay, and fatigue. One woman is carefully brushing cobalt blue onto the faint design on a plate. Her movements are slow, steady, a practiced rhythm born of repetition. You lean in and spot the faint pencil-like sketch beneath the glaze, a floral swirl that's part tulip, part something else. Maybe grapevine? Maybe nerves. "Third try," she murmurs, not looking up. "Last one cracked in the kiln." That's the thing about this work. It's fragile, before, during, and after. The glaze might bubble, the clay might warp, and even if the piece survives the heat, the cobalt might run or blotch. A slip of the brush, that's a ruined plate, and you start over. The phrase "behind the kiln door" is more than poetic. It's where the magic and the monotony happens. Here, tulips aren't symbols of flirtation or aristocracy. They're the 1,000th flower you've painted this month while trying not to sneeze into your glaze bucket. Historians still argue about the lives of Delft's ceramic workers. Were they proud artisans in respected guilds, or overworked laborers just trying to survive? Probably both, depending on who you ask and which factory you walk into. Guild records suggest some painters were known by name, masters of their craft even, admired, but many more were anonymous hands in a long chain of creation. They'd pass the work down the line. Someone shaped the clay, someone applied the glaze, someone else added the floral motif. Occasionally, one might add a hidden mark, a thumbprint in the base, a tiny dot under a leaf, a secret signature in a world where signatures weren't guaranteed. You peek into the kiln room. It's hotter than you imagined. Not roaring fire hot, more like a smoldering cave. Rows of plates are stacked on fireproof supports called saggers, layered like a dangerous game of ceramic Jenga. The man overseeing the kiln watches with a hawk's eye, his arms crossed. Timing is everything. A minute too long and the glaze goes matte. Too short and the color doesn't sing. He gestures to a cooling plate and says, "See that? Overfired. Bloom's too dark. It's a night tulip now." You nod solemnly. Night tulip. Sounds poetic, but it's a rejection. Maybe not trash, but certainly not showroom material. It might be sold at discount, given to a servant, or, if lucky, sent off to an export pile where someone in Portugal might think it's supposed to look like that. There's a myth that every tulip plate from Delft was a masterpiece, but in truth, the spectrum ran wide. Some were exquisite, fine lines, perfect symmetry. Others, a little lopsided, a bit abstract. But that inconsistency is part of the charm. These weren't printed by machine. They were born in fire and guesswork. You sit for a moment beside a young apprentice, maybe 13, scraping dried glaze from the edge of a bowl. He has a smear of blue across one eyebrow and doesn't seem to notice. He's focused, tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth. The bowl he's working on shows the early lines of a tulip so stylized it almost looks like a fleur-de-lis. A hint of personal flair? Or just a mistake? Does it matter? That tulip will end up on someone's dinner table, maybe in Amsterdam, maybe abroad, maybe in the home of a woman who hosts smug tea parties and secretly dreams of being a painter herself. Somewhere in this workshop you find a wall with test tiles, small ceramic squares with experimental glazes. Some are floral, some are geometric. One is just a pig wearing a hat. You blink. The artist shrugs. Practice tile. Bad day. These moments are easy to overlook in the grand sweep of ceramic history, but this is where the heart is, in the tired brush stroke, the rushed breakfast before the morning firing, the ache in your shoulder after painting 73 tulip petals before lunch. And yet, these people kept doing it, year after year, kiln after kiln, because someone had to. Because there was money, sure, but also pride, also artistry, also that stubborn, quiet love for making something that lasts. You glance at a finished plate now drying on a rack. The tulip at its center is slightly crooked, a little heavier on one side. The leaf leans away from the stem. And yet, it's beautiful. Not because it's perfect, but because someone made it in this heat, with these hands, under this pressure. And someone else, somewhere far from here, will treasure it, not knowing the name of the woman who painted it or the boy who scraped it clean. They'll just see a tulip, elegant, eternal, quietly blooming in glaze. You're walking now with a new sense of appreciation. Behind every tulip-draped plate you spot in a window, or every sugar bowl sitting in a parlor, you see them all. The woman with the aching wrist, the kiln master with soot in his hair, the apprentice and his crooked fleur-de-lis tulip. You know the labor. You know the heat. You know the failures. Which is what makes what you're about to see even stranger. There, balanced on the edge of a market stall, sits a chipped plate. A large one, oval, with once bold tulips now faded to a smoky blue-gray. A hairline crack runs straight through the center, like lightning frozen mid-flash. You can see the dull yellowish paste where someone tried to glue it back together, clumsily at that. And yet, it's not for sale. You ask the merchant about it. He shrugs. Family piece, not for trade. That's the thing. These pieces, even the broken ones, especially the broken ones, weren't always discarded. In fact, many were kept, cherished, passed down through generations like fragile diaries. A chipped tulip plate might have survived 2 wars, 4 marriages, and a toddler with a wooden spoon. That's not just crockery, that's history. You duck into another modest home, this one belonging to a widow in her 50s, who offers you a cup of chicory coffee and a seat by the hearth. On her mantel sits a jug with a cracked spout and a lopsided handle. You think, that poor thing, but she smiles when she sees you notice it. That was my grandmother's, she says. She dropped it during a thunderstorm when the dog ran under the table. We cried. Then we glued it. We still use it for tulips in the spring. You realize then, these weren't just dishes. They were witnesses. Each crack told a story. A dropped platter might mark the day a son returned from sea. A faded glaze could be the result of overuse during a long illness when meals had to be comforting and the same bowl was used again and again. Even better, the imperfections gave personality. A perfect set might impress the neighbors, but a plate with a tiny chip near the rim? That was yours. That chip meant something. It meant this one made it through. Historians still discuss the curious phenomenon of keepsake ceramics in the Dutch domestic sphere. Why keep damaged goods? Why treasure imperfect objects in a culture obsessed with order and symmetry? Some argue it was economic pragmatism. Ceramics were expensive, so nothing was wasted. Others see it as early emotional attachment to household objects. Or maybe it's simpler. Humans love things that survive, especially when they survive with us. You walk through a narrow alley behind a row of houses and spot something remarkable. A plate embedded in the brick wall. Just there, half visible, only the rim really. Someone must have used it as masonry filler when the wall was repaired. And guess what pattern decorates the exposed edge? A tulip. It feels like a relic. Accidental public art. You start noticing more of them. Broken fragments turned into garden edging. A plate shard used as a doorstop, a cracked cup on a windowsill with a candle stub inside. The pieces keep working, no longer as dishes, but as memories, as symbols, as oddly poetic refuse. There's even a tiny cottage industry forming around the practice. A woman in town makes brooches out of ceramic fragments, mostly tulips. She calls them shard charms. And when you ask if people buy them, she laughs. Oh, they cry first, then they buy 5. She hands you one. A sliver of a petal, faded but still blue, set into a pewter frame. You don't think you'll wear it, but you do slip it into your pocket. That night, you're invited to another dinner, smaller, simpler, a family meal. Bread, cheese, stewed onions, and not much else. But on the table are 3 plates, mismatched, clearly old. 2 with full tulip designs, one with only a partial bloom, peeking from the edge, the rest worn smooth by time and forks and hands. You find yourself staring at that partial tulip. It's barely there, more memory than decoration, and yet it holds your attention like nothing else in the room. You wonder who painted it, what went wrong in the firing, who bought it anyway, how many meals it has seen, how many hands it passed through, and why it still sits here on this humble table, doing its quiet work like always. You don't need the rest of the flower. You already know what it was. You wake to the sound of pigeons on a tiled roof, their cooing broken only by the gentle clatter of breakfast being prepared downstairs. It's a new day in Delft, and as you sit up in your borrowed attic room, you find yourself staring at the dish left on the washstand, a shallow bowl, pale blue around the edge, with a single graceful tulip painted in the center. No cracks, no chips, just calm beauty. But that calm, it didn't last forever. By the mid-1700s, the tulip craze that had once painted every breakfast and dinner with blue and white blooms began to cool. Not collapse, not vanish, but fade gently, like the glaze on an overwashed teacup. The obsession dulled and new styles crept in, sleeker forms, different colors, foreign motifs. A quiet shift. You step outside and walk toward the harbor where the canals feed into wider, wind-tossed waters. Goods still arrive here daily. Crates from the East Indies, rolls of silk, bags of coffee beans, and tucked among them now, new ceramics, real porcelain from China and Japan once again, flowing back into Europe after decades of geopolitical wobbling. And suddenly, those humble Dutch tulip plates don't look quite so exotic anymore. As more international goods returned to the market, the status game reset. A woman who once bragged about her Delft tulip dinner set now hesitated, eyeing her neighbor's imported Japanese tea service painted in gold and crimson. You didn't ditch your tulip plates, you just pushed them to the back shelf. Ceramic fashions moved on. Rococo designs flourished. Delicate pink roses, pastoral scenes, even mythological figures began appearing on plates. Tulips still lingered, but now they were quaint, like a beloved song you don't play at parties anymore. You stop by a ceramics shop and notice a display table labeled Traditionals. It features the classic blue tulip wares, arranged with more nostalgia than flair. A woman pulls her daughter over and says, "These are what your grandmother used." The girl shrugs. She's holding a plate with a cherub on it instead. And yet, the tulip didn't disappear. Even as tastes shifted, the old patterns were too deeply rooted to vanish entirely. They slipped into the background, yes, but they stayed, like family heirlooms too dear to discard, or like that chipped jug on the mantel, no longer trendy, but too storied to throw away. You wander through one of the old factories, now quiet. Some have shut down. Others have pivoted to other wares. One still makes tulip pieces, but fewer, and mostly for foreign collectors or old Dutch families clinging to tradition. The workers are older too. Fewer apprentices. The fire's still in the kiln, but it's not roaring like it once did. Historians still argue about what caused the decline. Was it the return of Chinese porcelain? Was it changing artistic tastes? Was it just fatigue? Too many tulips for too long? Possibly all of it. Possibly none of it. But one thing's clear. The tulip wasn't trendy anymore. It was enduring. You visit a home in the countryside, not far from Delft. The kitchen is warm, earthy, scented with bread and onions. And on the wall, above the hearth, hangs a plate, blue and white, faint glaze crackles like a spider web. A tulip in the center, graceful as ever. You ask about it. "Oh," the woman says, "that's been here longer than we have. Came with the house. Would be bad luck to take it down." That's the thing. The tulips may have faded from fashion, but they never stopped mattering. They just changed roles, from showpieces to symbols of home. The designs that once impressed guests now comforted families. The pattern that once shouted status now whispered belonging. You're invited to another dinner. Nothing grand, just neighbors and stew. The host grins when she brings out her plates. "They're old," she says, "but still good." Everyone always wants the one with the double tulip. She hands it to you, a wink in her eye. The plate is worn, but the double tulip glows faintly beneath the glaze. You run your fingers along the edge, careful not to drop it. It's heavier than it looks, the kind of weight you can't buy new. And during the meal, no one talks about fashion, no one compares patterns, no one subtly turns their plate to show off the stamp. But when a young boy knocks over his cup and it clatters loudly across the table, everyone gasps and then laughs, all at once, relief flooding the room when it doesn't break. "That one survived worse," someone says. And maybe that's the whole story. The tulip plates didn't vanish, they endured. Even when the mania faded, even when fashion changed, even when finer porcelain returned to the shelves, whispering of distant lands and imperial taste, the old tulip designs kept doing their quiet work, serving soup, holding bread, bearing memory. And that's not the end of a trend. That's the beginning of a legacy. You're on a different kind of street now. Still in the Netherlands, yes, but the year is creeping toward 1800, and something feels shifted. The edges are softer, the fashions lighter, and in one of those twisty time travel moments that only happen in bedtime history, you're standing in an antique shop in The Hague that smells of lemon oil, mothballs, and stories. The shelves are packed, not neatly, not proudly, but like someone's grandmother just kept adding things without ever taking anything out. And there, half hidden between a pewter candlestick and a wooden snuff box, a tulip plate. You recognize the shape instantly. Except this one is slightly off. The glaze is brighter, the tulips are too crisp, and the stamp on the back? It's not one of the original Delft factories. It's a fake, but a loving fake. Welcome to the world of revivalists, collectors, and the charming counterfeits that followed. By the early 19th century, a fun thing happened. People started missing the tulip ceramics they'd grown up with. Not the trendy ones, the old ones. The chipped ones from their grandmother's table. The plate that survived a house move or a wedding or a kitchen fire. Nostalgia swept through Dutch society like a warm draft. Suddenly, Delftware was back in fashion, but this time as heritage, not haute. Workshops that had shuttered decades before were reopened or bought up and rebranded. New owners weren't always craftsmen, they were businessmen. They saw the longing in people's eyes when they spotted a tulip bowl in a cousin's kitchen, and they thought, why not make more? And so they did. Reproductions hit the shelves, some honest, labeled as tributes to the old masters, others a little sneakier. They aged their wares with chemical washes, added faint crackle patterns, One even dragged the plates behind a wagon on a country road to weather the glaze. Tulip pattern forgeries became so common that by 1835, a small guild was formed solely to authenticate Delft Revival ceramics. Historians still debate whether these revivalists were preserving a tradition or just exploiting sentimentality. Did they love the art or the profit? As usual, probably both. You reach out and pick up the plate from the shelf. It's good. Not authentic, maybe, but lovingly made. The tulips curl with just the right touch of asymmetry. A small irregularity in the border tells you it wasn't mass-produced. Someone, somewhere, cared enough to get the mistake right. And collectors noticed. Throughout the 19th century, prominent Dutch families began scouring the countryside for original Delft tulipware. Auctions were held, estates were combed. A man once dug up an old plate from his garden and sold it for more than his cow was worth. Museums began to form entire ceramic wings. Tulips were back, but now behind glass. You pass through another room in the shop and find a stack of ceramic tiles. Several have the classic tulip design, but one has a signature, a rare thing. P. Van Gogh, 1782. Could be real, could be wishful thinking. Either way, someone believed it mattered. And this wasn't just a Dutch phenomenon. Collectors in England, France, and even the United States began hunting for tulip-themed Delftware. Some sought prestige, others genuinely loved the look. A few American collectors went overboard and filled entire dining rooms with imported blue and white plates. One heiress even had an all-tulip breakfast service and insisted on being served on it every morning, until her cat knocked over the sugar bowl. That ended the tradition. Meanwhile, forgers adapted. Some learned to imitate the old cobalt formulation. Others bought damaged originals and restored them, sometimes adding tulips where none had been. The line between genuine and imitation blurred, but most people didn't mind. A beautiful lie, if it reminds you of home, can be oddly comforting. Back in the shop, you strike up a conversation with the owner, an elderly man who claims his great-grandmother painted tulips on ceramic as a girl. He shows you a notebook filled with sketches, flowers mostly, and margins full of handwriting too faded to read. That's where the patterns came from, he says, tapping the pages. They weren't just copied, they were remembered. You realize then that the revival wasn't just about tulips. It was about memory. People missed a world where things were hand-painted, slightly flawed, meaningful. A world where your soup bowl came with a story. Even the counterfeits, in a strange way, became part of that story. Later that afternoon, you visit a manor house, now half museum, and in the dining room stands a glass cabinet. Inside, plates from 3 centuries sit together, originals, reproductions, and inspired by designs. No judgment, no hierarchy, just a quiet, gleaming homage. One is cracked and repaired with metal staples. Another gleams like it was made last week, but they all share the same curling tulip motif, elegant and eternal, blooming across the decades. You think about how many hands these plates have passed through, how many meals, mistakes, births and funerals they've witnessed, how many stories were told across them, and how many more were simply felt in silence. And somewhere between the original and the forgery, you realize the truth. Sometimes what lasts isn't the plate itself. It's the shape of the flower it once held. You're somewhere warmer now, more humid. The air carries the scent of cinnamon bark and tropical earth, and you're standing in the middle of a bustling port market, not in Delft, but in Batavia, present-day Jakarta. It's the early 1800s, and Dutch colonial trade is in full, complicated swing. And on a wooden stall table in the shadow of a banyan tree, a blue and white bowl painted with tulips. You blink. The design is unmistakable. Not exact. There's a looseness to the brushwork, a certain tropical flair. But yes, that's definitely a Dutch-styled tulip blooming out of local clay. Welcome to the global knock-on effect. It turns out, those iconic 1700s Delft tulip dishes didn't just stick around in Dutch kitchens and antique shops. They spread, and not by accident. You wander deeper into the market. The ceramics here are a vibrant mix of styles: Chinese export porcelain, Javanese earthenware, and surprisingly, a whole batch of blue and white platters that bear, well, let's say, inspired tulip designs. The stems curl in new directions. Some of the tulips look more like lotus flowers. One plate features a rooster standing in the tulip bed. It's glorious. Here's what happened. As Dutch colonial power expanded, so did the appetite for Delft-style ceramics. But shipping heavy, fragile plates halfway across the world was risky and expensive. So what did they do? They started making it locally. Dutch colonists and VOC, Dutch East India Company, traders, brought with them not only their hunger for spices and profits, but their tea habits, their table rituals, and their taste for tulip-painted dishes. And they wanted the comforts of home. That meant replicating familiar designs abroad. Potters in Batavia, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and even coastal Japan began producing ceramics that echoed the Delft style, using local materials and techniques. These weren't for export, at least not initially. They were for the colonists themselves, for their homes and offices and social clubs in faraway lands. Historians still debate whether this spread of tulip motifs was cultural imposition, aesthetic admiration, or something stranger, an unconscious migration of symbolism grafted onto new soils and new sensibilities. One thing is certain, the tulip had legs. You find yourself seated at a shaded cafe near the harbor, drinking clove tea from a cup that's almost Delft. The glaze is thinner, the pattern slightly smudged, but the tulip is there, stretched, stylized, and vibrant. You imagine a Dutch trader sipping from the same design a century ago, halfway around the world, comforted by the sight of home curling around his drink. There's something deeply human in that. Not far from the cafe, you visit a pottery workshop run by a local family. Inside, women sit cross-legged on woven mats, painting underglaze onto biscuit-fired cups. The man overseeing the kiln greets you and gestures toward a shelf of plates. The designs range from tropical birds to, yes, tulips, or at least their local cousins. You pick up one dish and notice something peculiar. The tulips are joined by bamboo stalks. The juxtaposition is both strange and seamless, the old Dutch aesthetic mingling with the new world's rhythm. And that's the magic of this ceramic diffusion. It wasn't strict copying. It was adaptation. Local artisans took the European obsession and made it their own. Some deliberately mimicked the Delft look to cater to colonists. Others blended styles because they liked how they looked. Even the Japanese got involved. In Arita and Imari, ceramic centers famous for their masterful glazes, potters began producing blue and white wares for export, many of which included floral motifs suspiciously similar to Dutch tulips. Sometimes they painted entire tableware sets specifically tailored to European tastes, even when tulips didn't mean much locally. It's a strange cycle. Dutch potters once copied Chinese porcelain. Then, Chinese and Japanese potters copied Dutch Delftware. And now, Delftware was echoing itself across the globe. You pass a European-style house in the hills outside Batavia and peek through a cracked window. On the dining table, a set of blue-glazed dishes with tulip designs flanked by peacocks and coconut palms. It's both colonial and hybrid, unsettling and beautiful. And here's the best part. Some of these overseas tulip ceramics made their way back to Europe. You read accounts of sailors returning home with Dutch dishes bought in Java or Sri Lanka, claiming them as heirlooms. Back in the Netherlands, families proudly displayed these slightly off tulip bowls in their cabinets, unaware or unconcerned that they'd been born of different soil. One Dutch merchant's widow even donated her great-grandmother's wedding tulip plates to a museum in the 1850s, only for curators a century later to realize they were 19th century Batavian imports. Which brings us to the debate that still hums in the background of ceramic history. What is authenticity? Is it where a plate was made, who painted it, what clay was used? Or is it the design, the memory embedded in the shape of a flower, the feelings it evokes? You leave Batavia's market with a small ceramic tile tucked in your pack. It's chipped, the glaze is imperfect, but there's a tulip there, long-stemmed, slightly wild, reaching towards something not quite seen. And you realize the tulip motif, once rigid and ritualized, has become something freer out here. A traveler, a dream of home blooming in unfamiliar hands. The train rattles gently as you head back through Europe now, the countryside blurring into a watercolor of trees, cottages, and afternoon clouds. You're chasing a plate. Not a specific one necessarily, but the idea of one. The kind of plate that somehow survived 3 centuries and 5 dining room shelves. You're following it all the way into a museum. You arrive at a grand echoing building in Amsterdam. Marble floors, high ceilings, whispered footsteps and echoey coughs. And somewhere inside, under soft lighting and a pane of glass so clean it disappears, you finally find it. A tulip plate. The real deal. You lean closer. The lighting makes the glaze gleam. The tulip in the center is vivid, curled with that signature asymmetry, just a bit off-center, as if it's bowing. The border is ringed with vines, and the whole thing has a quiet dignity that no photo could ever capture. You read the little plaque next to it. Delftware Charger, circa 1720. Acquired from a private collection. Believed to have belonged to a merchant family in Haarlem. And just like that, your imagination flares to life. You picture a dining room with cold floors and warm soup, a woman setting the table by lamplight, a child tracing the tulip with a fingertip during a long sermon at dinner, a storm outside, a dog underfoot. This plate saw all of it. The fact that it's here now, perfectly preserved, feels a little miraculous. Because, let's be honest, plates weren't meant to live this long. They were workhorses, scrubbed clean, dropped, chipped, replaced. And yet, somehow, this one not only survived, but was chosen to be remembered, cared for, tracked down, saved. You find a quiet bench nearby and sit. This museum holds dozens of tulip-patterned ceramics now, some stacked in glass cases, others arranged in elaborate table settings behind ropes. You wander slowly through the room, and it begins to feel like a chapel, not to religion, but to domesticity. The rituals of eating and drinking, of hosting and hoping, of carefully placing a plate on a table and knowing it's more than just porcelain. You find another dish, a deep bowl, cracked and mended with metal staples. The caption explains this was a common repair method in the 18th century, especially for cherished pieces. The staples are hand-forged, tiny silver stitches holding the past together. You wonder if anyone today would go to such trouble for a bowl. Historians still argue about how these objects were selected for museum collections in the first place. Was it craftsmanship, rarity, provenance, or simply the right donor at the right time? In truth, it's often a little arbitrary. Some plates survived because they were tucked in the back of a cupboard during a war. Others were passed down because they were too pretty to use. Some were rescued from attic trunks or old barns, found under floorboards, even pulled from shipwrecks. Yes, shipwrecks. There's one on display here from a VOC vessel that sank off the coast of South Africa. The crate it was in cracked open underwater, and the plate, remarkably intact, was recovered centuries later, still clutching its flower beneath layers of salt and time. You turn a corner and stumble into something unexpected, an interactive exhibit. There's a table set with replicas of tulip-themed tableware, and a screen behind it loops stories from different people, some Dutch, some not, talking about the objects they grew up with. One woman recalls her grandmother serving cookies on a chipped tulip saucer every Sunday after church. Another man remembers hiding a secret note under a floral plate during a dinner party. A third simply says, "I don't know where our family got it, but it's always been there, like the clock or the cat." You listen for a while, heart-warmed by how ordinary the memories are, and how universal. The plate might have started in Delft, but its meaning now lives wherever someone remembers it. Before you leave, you stop by the museum gift shop. Of course, they sell replicas, not exact copies. Those would be too expensive, but gentle echoes. Mugs with stylized tulips, kitchen towels, even puzzle sets. One ceramic tile magnet catches your eye. You buy it, slip it into your pocket next to the Batavian fragment from earlier. They clink softly. Outside, the city bustles. Trams rumble, bicycles buzz past, and people speak half a dozen languages. But somewhere nearby, in someone's kitchen, a tulip plate is probably holding an apple tart or a cheese sandwich, or maybe just sitting quietly in a hutch, waiting for company. You feel strangely proud of it. This object, once part of a fad, a dinner party competition, a whispered flirtation tool, now rests behind museum glass, not because it was the finest, but because it survived, because someone cared, because history clings best to the things we used, not the things we merely displayed. And it's funny, isn't it, that a plate designed for soup, adorned with a tulip copied from a garden thousands of miles away, now speaks louder than many books. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It just is. You're on the road again, this time to a farmhouse tucked between pastures, windmills, and a smell that can only be described as cheese adjacent. The pace here is slower, the roads bumpier, the conversations quieter. But inside this modest country home, something unexpectedly profound is about to greet you. The subtle power of porcelain. Specifically, what it never said out loud. You're seated at a wooden table, worn soft at the corners. A cup of barley coffee rests near your elbow, steam rising gently. And in front of you, once again, is a tulip plate. Just one, not part of a set, slightly yellowed with age, but no cracks, no chips. Its glaze softens the edges of the flower, which curves inward, as if bowing. Your host, a retired school teacher with a knack for storytelling and exactly 7 cats, points at the plate with a fond smile. That one was always out for birthdays, she says. Not because it was fancy, but because it meant someone cared enough to use the good dish. And there it is. The unspoken language of tulip-themed tableware. The things it never meant to say, but did anyway. You sip your coffee and begin to see the deeper threads. In an era where most people never traveled far, never held property, never left a legacy in ink or oil paint, a tulip plate could speak volumes. Without uttering a word, it said, "We have beauty here. We have taste. We have continuity." The dish wasn't just a dish, it was a messenger. It carried expectations that you'd set the table properly, that you'd serve the stew with pride, that you'd respect the ritual of sitting down, passing the bread, and nodding politely, even when Uncle Hendrik made the same story last 3 courses. It also carried judgments. Remember the dinner party arms race? The not-so-accidental serving of guests on the less perfect plate, the floral arrangements that hinted at status and relationship, and occasionally barely concealed disdain. Tulip tableware knew how to play the game. Historians still debate just how conscious this class signaling really was. Did people mean to weaponize a sugar bowl, or did the codes develop slowly, subconsciously, like a regional accent? One theory suggests that for the merchant class, rising in wealth but not yet in aristocratic blood, the tulip pattern offered a bridge. It allowed them to express refinement without risking accusations of arrogance. A beautiful dish could say, "We're cultured," without saying, "We think we're better than you." Unless, of course, that's exactly what they wanted to say. And here's where it gets even trickier. In many homes, tulip tableware was inherited, not just bought. And when something passes from one generation to the next, it picks up emotional gravity. That plate on your grandmother's table might look like any other, but you know which one she set aside when the bishop came to tea. You remember the time your little brother chipped it and the whole room went silent. Suddenly, it's not about class. It's about identity. There's a story of a Dutch woman in the early 1900s who took her mother's tulip plate with her when emigrating to America. She packed it in straw, inside a bread box, inside her suitcase. When she arrived, it was the only thing that hadn't broken. She kept it on her mantel for 50 years, never used it once. Sometimes silence is the loudest language. You stand up and walk through the farmhouse kitchen, fingers brushing the shelves. There's more Delftware here. Not a matched set, just a few survivors. A milk jug with a faded stem, a tile showing a tulip and a ship, a saucer with a petal that looks like it was painted by a sneeze. And yet they all speak. Together they form a portrait, not of one person, but of many. Not of one life, but of how lives are layered. Every scratch is a moment, every imperfection, a memory. Even the way these pieces are displayed tells a story. In some homes, they're proudly lined up behind glass. In others, they're quietly functional, still used for tea or cookies or spare change. Each arrangement says something different. This mattered once. This still matters. This doesn't matter, but I'm not quite ready to let it go. You head outside again. The light is different now. Longer, lower. Everything is brushed in gold. And suddenly you understand why tulips, of all things, held such power. They bloom briefly. They don't last long in the ground, but in glaze, in ceramic, they endure. The plates became their own kind of flower, meant not to wilt, but to hold. Hold warmth, hold pride, hold family dinners and inherited expectations and the gentle weight of history. And even when the flower faded, when fashion changed and cobalt glaze gave way to Art Deco and plastic Tupperware, those quiet tulips stayed tucked in cupboards, in corners, in memory, still blooming, still speaking. You're back in Delft one last time. Not the Delft of the bustling 1700s workshops or dinner party rivalries. This Delft is quieter, slower. A city that's learned how to live beside its own history instead of sprinting ahead of it. The canals still glisten, the bricks still creak underfoot, and the sky, forever a brushed pewter dome, hangs low, familiar. You walk down a narrow street you've passed before, but this time you notice a shop. It's small, no sign, just a single plate hanging in the window, framed by lace curtains. Blue tulips, faint but unmistakable. You step inside. The bell above the door gives a half-hearted jingle, and the warm scent of beeswax polish greets you. The shop is narrow and deep, more hallway than showroom. Shelves climb the walls, crowded with ceramics, some pristine, some clearly loved, some so cracked they're barely holding together. A cat sleeps on a windowsill. A radio hums softly in the background, playing something old and unhurried. And then she appears. The shopkeeper is in her 60s, maybe 70s, wrapped in a cardigan that looks like it might unravel if you blink too hard. She doesn't smile, not at first. She simply nods, as if to say, "You look like someone who needs a plate." You browse slowly. One shelf holds butter dishes shaped like tulip bulbs. Another is dedicated to mismatched saucers, each with a tiny slip of paper tucked inside. Windmill bloom, C. 1790. 3-leaf variant, probable export piece. Unknown artist, maybe left-handed. You chuckle at that one. Eventually, you stop in front of a single plate. Simple. No gold edging, no extravagant scroll work, just one tulip painted slightly off-center. The glaze has that soft, barely there crackle, the sign of centuries lived gracefully. And you recognize it immediately. It's the same pattern you saw on your first morning here, in the very first shop. Or maybe it's a cousin. Maybe they were made within days of each other. Maybe they were separated for generations. Now they've come full circle. You lift the plate gently. It's cool and heavier than it looks. You can feel its story, not as a clear, coherent narrative, but as an emotional hum, like a lullaby with no words. You imagine all the places it could have been. A merchant's table, a widow's shelf, a ship's pantry, a museum crate. And now, here, in your hands. The shopkeeper watches, but doesn't speak. She's seen this moment before. You finally ask, How much? She shrugs. For you, take it. You try to protest, but she shakes her head. Someone saved it once. Someone passed it down. Now it's your turn. You wrap it carefully. Too carefully. It's endured 300 years. One modern tote bag won't be its undoing. But still, you can't help being gentle. As you leave, the bell gives one final sleepy chime, and the door shuts behind you with a hush. Outside, the light is soft. Golden hour. You walk slowly along the canal, the plate tucked under your arm, and suddenly the city feels different. Not like a museum or a stage set, not like the backdrop of a history video. It feels like home, because that's what the tulip plate has become. Not just an object, but a signal. A stand-in for family, memory, continuity. A quiet promise that beauty doesn't have to be loud. That something hand-painted and slightly off-center can matter more than anything glossy and new. You pause on a bridge and look down at the water. Your reflection flickers there, joined by rooftops and chimneys and that perpetual Dutch sky. You think about everything this one dish represents. The rise and fall of fashion, the hum of colonial trade, the rituals of dinner and ceremony, the lives of painters and kiln masters and teenage apprentices trying to stay awake. You think about the families who kept these plates long after they'd lost their shine, not because they were valuable, but because they were theirs. You think about all the things people leave behind and all the quiet things that remember them. And just for a moment, you stop walking. You simply stand there, tulip plate in hand, held by a history too quiet to shout and too strong to forget. Now, as you settle into bed, the story softens. The footsteps fade. The workshop doors close. The candle flickers low beside a plate on a shelf, its tulip bathed in the faintest light. You can almost feel the glaze under your fingertips, smooth and cool and old. Time moves differently here. You think of the people who painted those petals, not with grand ambition, but with care. Day after day, brush after brush, petal after petal. Their names are mostly lost, but their work remains, held in the curve of every vine, the droop of every bloom. You imagine a quiet table by a fire, where hands pass bread and bowls, where laughter hums low, and plates clink gently. Not every meal was grand, not every moment important, but they built something lasting all the same. Let your breath slow now. Let your thoughts drift, petal by petal, along blue and white curves that loop like lullabies. Each tulip, a gentle whisper. Each plate, a remembered touch. And know